Okay, we're going to talk about preparing to read as an important reading skill. Now, the very first thing that you want to do when you're preparing to read a book is to learn about the author. It's interesting. This is something that's actually controversial. You wouldn't think that learning about the author would be important either way necessarily. But there are literally some schools and professors and teachers that will tell you not to learn anything about the author or the background of the book before you read it, so that you go into the work unbiased. Now, I'm not saying sometimes that couldn't be legitimate. That might be a good idea sometimes. And maybe you would go into it cold and you would get out of it what was there and you would just see it for what it was. And then you could go back to it again, having more information. There's a couple reasons why I don't like that idea. My experience is, first of all, that there's so much great reading to do that there's not time. There's not time to go through a work more than once. And if you go into it cold and you get out of it what you get out of it, that's fine. But you're never going to retain the same amount of information as if you go into it informed. And knowing about the author, when they lived, where they were from, why they wrote the book, is actually helps with retention of the material. It places it in a time and place. You could look on a timeline for when they lived and who else lived at the same time as them. And just a little bit, I mean, we're talking, this whole process that I'm going to talk about of preparing to read, an hour or two, it's not that big of a deal. But a major reason for doing it is the retention issue. And also the book is going to mean so much more to you. Now, I'm saying book, it might be anything. It might be a speech, it might be an essay, it might be a play. There's all kinds of examples that I could give you. Understanding about Marx and who he was and how he lived and how he wrote against capitalism while he lived off of capitalism, those kinds of things add to the experience of, oh, well, actually a hypocrite. Maybe hypocrite's a strong word, but it was kind of hypocritical, some of the things that he did. He's kind of an extreme example. Of course, he's the author, Karl Marx, of the Communist Manifesto. It really will make your experience so much better. That's why we do author bios on the blog, because sometimes we don't do every single author from every single reading, but we try to do them regularly and delve into some of the information that you might not be able to get just like on Wikipedia, or that we feel is the most important or is critical to understand about that author, because it will make a difference in your experience in the work. So the second thing, I'm going to talk first about nonfiction works. When it's a nonfiction work, you want to do two things, okay? I'm just going to put nonfiction up here. The first thing that you want to do with nonfiction is get a little bit of background on the book. This can go along with your author study, but also, like, if it's a nonfiction book, usually it's the outgrowth of some kind of study or research or experiments or those kinds of things. The author is Newton, the author is Hawking, the author is, I don't know. Anybody that's writing a nonfiction, doesn't have to be science, it could be anything, it could be a self-help book. But lots of times you'll find that that's the outgrowth of, 5 Love Languages, for example, was the outgrowth of, I think it's 25, 30 years of therapy. So what's the background on how this work came to be? How did the author discover this information? Why do they feel it's important? So it's kind of tied into the author, but the author is kind of like about their life and their belief systems. And that's an important thing to note about the author is, what did they believe and why did they believe that, and what did they live true to, that kind of thing, and what were some important events in their lives. The background of the book is, how did that book come to be? I'll give you a quick example. It comes to mind. To Kill a Mockingbird. So, is it Harper Lee, I think, is the author? I can't remember. Seems like that's who it is. To Kill a Mockingbird is kind of a compilation of stories, real true stories from her childhood. And so you can learn about her and her childhood and where she was living, what she was doing. But when you go to understand the background, now this background search of how the book was written, it's also true of fiction. But there's some things that we'll do differently with fiction. So she was living in New York or somewhere, and she had a circle of friends, and she would tell these friends stories from her childhood in the South. And they were fascinated by them. And she wanted to be an author, and they talked often. You know, her friends would encourage her, you should write them down, you should write them down. And she just couldn't find the time. She couldn't make it a priority. She worked best when she was undisturbed for long periods of time. And so there was a couple that she was good friends with, and they talked and thought and decided to make a sacrifice for her. And they had a large chunk of savings, and so they came to her and they said, we want to put you up in an apartment for a year and pay for your living expenses to allow you in an undisturbed environment to write this book. Well, that's an incredible background to why that book was written and how it came to be, and also that it's true stories from her childhood, some things that really happened about real people. So that's really interesting to note. Now, how should I say that? Peruse the book, okay? So, after you know a little bit about it, look through it. Look at the table of contents and get an idea of what some of the chapter headings are, what content you can expect from it, and then go back through the index. Index, contents, there's the jacket. Become a little bit familiar. If you look in the index of any nonfiction work, well, that an index that's done well, you'll notice that there'll be long, there'll be some, it'll go along and it'll have it alphabetized, and maybe it'll be about people or events or concepts or whatever it is. And then there'll be some that have, half a page, maybe a page of references on that person or on that concept. Well, you'll know right away, that's really important stuff to pay attention to. And of course, all of this is preparing for marking your book, which are reading skills that we'll discuss in the future, probably in 2 or 3 segments, because marking a book well is so important. It can be done many different ways. Anyway, we'll talk about that later, but looking over the book and being familiar with what's in it, you really can't do this in fiction works, but in nonfiction there's lots of information that give you clues to the content that will help you in marking your book well. Now in fiction, you want to do this one, right? Like you want to know the background of how it was written, and it was a novel actually that I told you the background of it. There's, if we go back to the Marx example, it was written because he was supported financially by a friend Engels' father, who was a successful capitalist, and there was an international conference of communists, and Marx was one of the leaders, and so they appointed Marx and Engels to write it. That's how the Communist Manifesto came to be written. Really interesting how these came to be written. 2 other things I'm going to say right now that are going to be, they're going to be painful for you to hear, okay? And if you cannot bring yourself to do it, I understand. But the time will come when you appreciate this. What I'm going to tell you now about preparing to read fiction is so valuable. And the reason that I embraced it was largely because I learned how to really read well as an adult, as a mother. So the thing is that I didn't have very much time, right? And so I'm always about, I got to streamline my time. I do not have a lot of time. And what these skills, along with marking skills, allowed me to do was read a book once forever. Now, I have my favorites, and I'll read them more than once sometimes, but I can go back to a book that I read 10 or 15 years ago, and if I did this correctly, if I prepared to read properly, and then I marked the book well, I can review the book in less than half an hour and discuss it with anybody. That's important for a teacher, that's important for a child, that's important for an adult, for a parent, because you never know when you're going to be going through that book again, right? Like if you're a parent, I use books to help me parent. I tell the stories that are in my favorite books. I will hand certain books to my children to teach certain lessons so that other people teach it and teach it better than I could. And we do a lot of discussing, which trains thinking skills and my highest priority, it trains character. So I want to use books for self-improvement and truth and to build character, so I need to be able to get the most out of them the very first time and then be able to review them and discuss them and use them effectively in the future. And the very best way for me to do that with fiction reading, and we do a lot of fiction reading. I would say it's at least half and half, maybe more, that we do fiction reading to nonfiction. Most people. What you're going to do is, before you read, you're going to learn about the plot and you're going to learn about the characters. Now, going back to why read, you may think, oh no! I mean, like, if your primary purpose for reading is entertainment, this blows it, right? Like that just blew the whole reason that I was going to read that book. Because now I know the plot, and now I know the characters, and I know what's going to happen. Now, when I do blog posts, I don't do spoilers. Like, I won't tell you everything that happens at the end of the book, but I always highly recommend that people spend a little bit of time. You can find this on the internet in a minute. And there's a bigger reason for it than just marking well and remembering it and getting the most out of it. If you're all caught up in plot, and my mentor was the one that first turned me on to this and helped me understand how important this was. If you're caught up in who the characters are and how they're related, like the first time I read, and this is a big one, War and Peace, I think there's 25 or 30 characters introduced in the first 6 pages. It's ridiculous. Now that's not always the case, but lots of times it's hard to keep the characters straight, how they're related, who they are. So authors will use multiple names for them. This helps you mark the book well, and it helps you review it quickly in the future. And if you're a youth reading it for the first time, I promise you, if it's a good enough book to study, to read well, to use reading skills on, you'll use it later in life. You'll want to use it as a parent or with friends or whatever, run a discussion on it, teach it, whatever. Just find something in it, right? Like that's what we want to be able to do too, is find something in it. If you go into the book not worrying about what's going to happen, then you have the opportunity to look for principles and truth and focus on self-improvement and mark it well and look for other things besides the plot. That doesn't mean you can't know what happens in the end. It just means that you might know what happened in the end of the book, but I promise it doesn't, everybody thinks it's going to ruin it, it doesn't ruin it. Because you might know what happens, but you don't know how it happens. You don't know how it got there. Now, the reason that we do this is to find a why. Okay? And this goes into another reading skill, which is one theme, and we'll talk about that one in another post. But you will find a why. When you understand a little bit about the author and the background and the plot and the characters, you'll start to realize there's a higher reason for you to read this book. Happened to me when I didn't want to read Lord of the Rings with my son, and we did all the preliminary research and study, and I discovered the ring is a symbol of temptation, and then I wanted to read the book. It will help you know why you're reading that book, and that why will help you, and keep that in mind as you watch other reading skills, because having this why in your reading will help you with your marking, your one theme, your thought papers, and all the other things that you'll do in your reading. So, preparing to read, do it. It will make all the difference. See you next time.